Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the kind of story that makes you check twice if your doors are locked. It's after midnight. The only sound in my apartment is the faint hum of the fridge. The light from the TV flickers across the room. I'm slouched on the couch in sweatpants, flipping through the most uninspired lineup of early morning programming when the phone rings. A landline, mind you, already weird. No one calls a landline after midnight unless someone's dead or in jail. I let it ring once, twice. Then I get up, drag myself to the kitchen, and answer it. Mr. Freeman. It's a woman's voice. Calm, measured, definitely not a telemarketer. This is Detective Sarah Miller. I'm calling regarding your father, Reverend Elijah Freeman. Now that's a name I haven't heard out loud in a long time. I grip the edge of the countertop. Is this a joke? No, sir. Earlier today, a logger in a restricted part of the Ozark Forest discovered a vintage Adidas duffel bag buried under a tree stump. Inside were a robe and a Bible, both with your father's name. Pause. I feel cold all of a sudden. Not fridge door left open cold, something older, deeper. Like my bones forgot how to be bones. You're sure? Yes, sir. We'd like you to come down and identify the items. Officers are en route to pick you up now, if that's all right. It's not all right. Nothing about this is all right. But I say yes anyway. What else could I say? I hang up the phone and walk slowly to my bedroom to change. I feel like I'm sleepwalking, or like I've been walking in sleep for 25 years and something just hit the alarm clock. Here's the thing, my father vanished in 1970. He was a respected pastor in a small town that barely showed up on state maps. No note, no fight, just gone. I was 17. My mom had passed away the year before, and when Dad disappeared, it felt like the universe just folded in on itself. There were whispers he ran off with a woman, he lost his mind, he faked his death. Some said suicide, others said race had something to do with it. But there was no body, no evidence, no closure, just rumors Sunday after Sunday getting more twisted every year. I threw away my Bible 3 months later, lost faith in God, lost faith in everything really. I haven't stepped into a church in decades, can't even watch religious programming without wanting to change the channel. That was my father's world, and it turned its back on us. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you were watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soft noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. The cruiser is quiet as it cuts through the outskirts of town. Officer in the front doesn't talk much. I'm too busy watching the trees pass in fast blurs, thinking how many years those roots must have kept secrets buried. 15 minutes later, we pull up to the site. It's deep in the woods, the kind of deep that makes your cell signal start waving a white flag. There are work lights strung between trees, officers moving like slow ghosts through the undergrowth, yellow tape wrapped around a stump. That Stump. Detective Miller meets me near the perimeter. She's older than I expected, silver hair in a tight braid, eyes like she's seen some things and cataloged each one. Mr. Freeman, she says, shaking my hand. This is Tom Jenkins, the logger who made the discovery. Tom looks like every woodsman, ever flannel shirt, calloused hands beard you could get lost in. Sorry about the circumstances, he says. Wish I'd found something else under there. He gestures to the stump. Tree had been dead for years. We were clearing out the brush when I noticed it was hollow underneath. Started digging. Bag was wedged down under the roots. The Adidas bag is sitting on a tarp nearby. Vintage. Faded stripes. I don't remember my dad owning anything like it. One of the officers carefully opens the bag. First the robe. Burgundy line trimmed with gold thread. Slightly mildewed but intact. Then the Bible. Water damaged but readable. When they flipped to the front cover, I stopped breathing. Elijah Freeman, my father's name in his exact handwriting. I don't say anything for a moment. Just stare. Is that? Yes, I finally whisper. That's his. They find a loose page tucked into the back, a personal prayer. I read it aloud, voice catching on the words, Lord, do not let the weight crush me. If I fail to do what is right, let your judgment be swift. Give me courage to stand in the storm. Detective Miller raises an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like someone preparing to run away. I shake my head. He would never. There's a silence. Heavy, like the forest is listening in. And just like that, something I thought was buried for good begins to stir. They say time heals, but they don't tell you what to do when it doesn't. The drive back to town was longer than I remembered. Or maybe the air just felt heavier now that my father's handwriting had re-entered my life like a ghost that never needed a key. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't go to bed. Sleep wasn't going to happen, not with my thoughts circling like vultures. Instead, I went straight to the spare room, my own little archive. Shelves of old books, my father's books to be exact. I kept them all after the house was sold. The rest of our lives were packed into boxes donated or lost, but this room, this was the only part I preserved. On the shelves were decades of sermon notes. My dad was meticulous. Each year had its own notebook. Leather-bound, labeled neatly on the spine. 1971, 1972, all the way up to 1976, and then nothing. I blinked, ran my fingers along the gap. 1907 was missing. I checked the others. Maybe it had fallen behind or been misfiled. Nope, still gone. That's when the cold returned. A different kind of cold memory cold. I remembered packing these books when I was still raw with grief. It was late summer 2000. I hadn't looked closely at them then, just scooped them up in a daze and stuffed them in boxes. But now I was seeing things clearly. His personal diaries were here too. Years of private thoughts written in looping script. I flipped through them, half afraid of what I'd find. But again, no 1907. It was like that whole year had been cut out of his life. I sat down heavily on the edge of the guest bed. I was 17 when he vanished. That was supposed to be the year I got my driver's license, finished high school, maybe even left for college. But instead, I got funeral casseroles with no funeral, pity looks from churchgoers, and a deep, slow-burning resentment that I mistook for maturity. Why were the 1907 records missing? He'd never missed a year before, unless he knew something was coming. And maybe, just maybe, someone didn't want those writings found. I stood up and made a decision. I wasn't going to sit in this apartment wondering. I needed to go back to the source, to the place I had avoided for 25 years. Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. The church was exactly 10 minutes from my apartment. My stomach was in knots the entire way. Funny, I used to take this route every Sunday without fail. Now the turns felt foreign, like I was driving through someone else's dream. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Not in that you grow up and everything shrinks kind of way. Just tired. The white paint had yellowed. The sign out front had missing letters. The sanctuary's stained glass windows still gleamed in the morning light, but the polish couldn't hide the wear. I parked and just sat for a second. Part of me expected someone to run out yelling, as if I had no right to return, but I finally stepped out clutching one of the older sermon notebooks I'd brought for reference. It still smelled like old paper and dust. Inside, the air was cooler than outside. Wooden pews lined the sanctuary. The pulpit stood tall, unchanged. I remembered standing behind that thing at 16, doing a practice sermon with my dad. I'd choked on my first sentence. He told me afterward, if you can't speak from your heart, don't speak at all. And now here I was, heart wide open, voice shaky. An elderly man near the altar turned as I approached. "Can I help you, son?" "I hope so," I said. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The man gave me a curious look. "And who was your father?" "Elijah Freeman." He froze, then his expression softened. "My lord." "Marcus, is that you?" I nodded slowly. "Boy, you've grown," he said, coming forward. "It's been, 25 years. I'm Pastor Harold Whitmore. I worked with your father every Sunday." "I remember," I said, "you used to give out peppermints to the kids after service." He laughed. "Still do." There was a long pause. He looked like he wanted to hug me, but wasn't sure if it would be welcomed. It wasn't. Not yet. "I'd like to speak with you and anyone else who worked with my father back then," I said. "There's been a discovery." "Wait right here," Harold said. "Reverend George is in the back. He'll want to see you." A few minutes later, another older man entered. Slower, more frail, but his eyes were sharp. I remembered those eyes from when I was a kid. They were always watching. "Marcus," he said, "as I live and breathe, you're the spitting image of Elijah." I forced a polite smile. "Do you have time to talk?" They both nodded, motioning me to sit. I didn't waste any time. Police found my father's robe and Bible in the forest yesterday, buried under a stump. Detective Miller asked me to help identify them. Both men went silent. I continued, but something's missing. His 1907 sermon notes, his diary, they're not at home. I checked. Harold folded his hands. Your father was a good man, Marcus, but no one really knew what he was thinking in those last weeks. That's why I'm here. I need to know what had happened before he disappeared. George spoke up. We did notice some changes. He spent more time alone, praying, sometimes crying, but he never said why. I pulled out the sermon notebook from 1976. He wrote everything down. If he was struggling, it'd be in the 1977 volume. The two men exchanged a glance. Then Harold said, let's check the church office. Maybe there's something we overlooked. I followed them to a room that used to be my father's study. Now it was someone else's office, but the furniture was the same. The old bookshelf stood in the corner like a forgotten witness. We searched, drawer after drawer, shelf after shelf, nothing. Moved on to the church library next, bigger space, more dust. I placed my notebook on the reading table and joined the search. An hour passed, still no trace of 1907. As we were wrapping up, I apologized for the trouble. You didn't cause any, George said kindly. I hope you find what you're looking for. I nodded and stepped out of the library. What I didn't realize, what would haunt me for hours afterward, was that I had left my father's sermon notebook sitting on the table behind me. And I wouldn't realize it until it was already too late. I didn't notice the notebook was gone until I was halfway across town. My plan had been simple: head home, reread some of my father's older notes, and start sketching out what questions I'd ask the detective next. But as I pulled into my apartment parking lot, something nagged at me. You know that feeling when you leave the stove on or forget your keys? Yeah, that. I mentally retraced my steps. Library conversation, search table. Ah, no. I checked the passenger seat. Nothing. Checked the back seat. Still nothing. Glove box, floorboards, trunk because, hey, why not, gone? I cursed under my breath. Not profanely, just the kind of soft, frustrated sound you make when you know you've done something dumb and there's no one to blame but yourself. That notebook was important. It had my father's own handwriting, his structure, his thoughts, everything I'd wanted to use as a reference to identify whether anything found later was his. And more than that, it was like holding a piece of him. You don't just forget something like that. Except I had. The sky was starting to dim early evening, casting long shadows over the streets. I could have driven straight back to the church, but something inside me shifted. Not guilt exactly. Grief. I found myself turning toward the town cemetery instead. Maybe it was the day's emotions catching up to me. Or maybe, okay, this will sound weird, it just felt like I owed someone a visit. I stopped at a corner flower shop across from the cemetery. A bell chimed softly as I entered. The florist was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, wearing thick glasses and a kind smile. Can I help you, sweetheart? She asked, already reaching for wrapping paper. I'm visiting someone, I said. My mother, it's been a while. She nodded without asking more, which I appreciated. Wrapped a small bouquet of daisies and lilies, modest but thoughtful. As she tied the bow, she asked, special occasion, number, just long overdue. The cemetery was quiet. A breeze rustled the trees overhead, and the gravel path crunched under my shoes like a soundtrack to old memories. My mother's grave was easy to find. I'd been there often as a teen, less so as an adult. Her name was carved in clean script, Sarah Freeman, beloved wife and mother. I knelt and placed the flowers down. Hey, Mom, I said softly. Sorry it's been so long. And just like that, I started talking. About the phone call, the discovery in the woods, the missing notebook. About the church and the weirdly polite pastors who now felt less like mentors and more like characters in a crime novel. I didn't expect a reply, obviously, but speaking out loud made things feel real. Made me feel real after floating in mystery all day. Then I heard it. Crying, not the wind, not some grieving adult. It was a child's sob, sharp and high and unmistakable. I stood up slowly and followed the sound winding around a hedge until I saw him. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, sitting alone under a tree. Tear-streaked face. Hoodie too big for his frame. Hey there, I said gently, stopping a few feet away. You okay? He startled but didn't run. just wiped his face with his sleeve. "What's your name?" I asked. "Robbie," he mumbled. "Hi, Robbie. I'm Marcus." I glanced around. "Are your parents here with you?" He shook his head and pointed to a grave. His voice was a whisper. "My mom." I knelt down to his level. "I'm sorry, buddy." He nodded, eyes brimming again. "I don't want to go home." "Why not?" "My aunt and uncle don't like me." That one hit harder than I expected. After my dad vanished, I stayed with relatives too. They didn't say they disliked me, but you don't have to use words when your silence says everything. I was a burden, a ghost shadow always there in the hallway. "I understand," I said. "You want to stay here for a while?" He nodded. "Okay, I'll stay with you." He leaned into me a little. Didn't speak. Just sat there while the sky got darker and the air cooler. Then I touched his shoulder and flinched. He was burning up. "Robbie," I said, voice sharper than I meant. "You've got a fever. A bad one." He tensed immediately. "Please don't take me home. I'm not." I promised. "But you need help. A doctor." He looked scared. "Can't we just go to a church instead?" That threw me. Why?" He sniffled. "When I was sick, my mom used to get communion from the church and bring it home. She said it helped." Suddenly I was 9 years old again, watching my dad prepare those little communion cups for shut-ins. He always made extras. Said faith traveled better in grape juice than people gave it credit for. "I know what that is," I said. "My dad was a pastor. We can do that. But you still need a hospital, Robbie. Let's make a deal. We'll go there first, and then I'll bring you communion." "Okay." He hesitated, then nodded. The hospital staff took one look at the boy's condition and swept him away. I explained what I could, where I found him, what he'd said. They didn't ask many questions. I think they sensed something deeper behind his silence, the kind you don't dig into right away. As he was wheeled back, he turned to me. "You promised." "I'll keep it," I said. After signing a few forms, I left the ER and sat in my car. The sun had fully set. I checked my phone. Still no missed calls. Still no answers. And then, of course, I remembered the notebook. The one I'd left behind at the church, again. I started the car and headed back. Lights from the hospital fading behind me as I turned toward the only place that still had more questions than I could count. The church was almost empty when I got back. A few dim lights glowed through the stained glass windows, casting slanted rainbows onto the sidewalk. I parked near the front and walked to the doors, expecting them to be locked. But to my surprise, they swung open easily with a push. No Harold, no George. Instead, a young man I didn't recognize stood behind a folding table in the vestibule, typing something on a laptop. Early 20s hair, tied back hoodie over a button-up shirt. Looked more like a student volunteer than a church employee. "Hi there," he said as I stepped inside. "Need help with something?" And I nodded. "I was here earlier today. Met with pastors Harold and George. I think I left a notebook in the library." Named Marcus Freeman, son of Reverend Elijah Freeman. That name still had weight, apparently. The young man's eyes widened. "Oh, wow, I've heard of your father, yeah. So has everyone today, apparently." He gestured down the hall. "Let's check the library. If it's there, we'll find it." We walked together in silence. His shoes squeaked faintly on the polished floor. I glanced around, same wood paneling, same bulletin board pinned with yellowing flyers and baptism photos from 5 years ago. In the library, the lights were off. He flicked them on and we stepped inside. And there it was, sitting neatly on the table where I'd left it, my father's sermon notebook. Unopened, untouched. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest releasing like a valve. "Thank God," I murmured, picking it up and brushing dust from the cover. "I can't believe you still have those," the staffer said, peering at it curiously. "I didn't even know your father kept written sermons. He kept everything I said, especially when he thought someone might try to erase it." I turned to leave, then paused. Something on the top shelf caught my eye. A book slightly tilted outward just enough to be out of line with the others. It looked like it had been shoved back hastily, not fully inserted. And it was thick, heavy looking. "I should fix that before it falls." I said more to myself than to him. The staffer stepped forward. "I can get it." But I was already reaching. I'm tall, so it wasn't hard. I slid the book out and immediately felt the weight of it shift awkwardly in my hands. It slipped, hit the floor with a solid thud, and burst open at the middle pages, sprawling like startled wings. "Sorry," I muttered, kneeling. No worries, the staffer said, crouching beside me. It happens. I looked at the title, Church Financial Management and Stewardship. Typical church read. But something inside made me flip it open anyway. And that's when I saw it. Notes, in the margins, written in my father's handwriting, sharp, deliberate strokes, loops that dipped just enough to identify them. He always wrote in pen black or dark blue, and always with conviction. I turned a few pages, more notes, more underlines, and then two names. Written faintly in pencil like they'd once been heavily circled, but later erased: Harold Whitmore, George Langston, both followed by small question marks. My breath caught. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. I tilted the page toward the light. Even with the erasure, the pressure marks from the pencil were still there. He'd written those names hard, almost angrily. My father suspected them of something. Church fund embezzlement. That seemed to be the theme. The pages he annotated were all about transparency, misappropriation, financial integrity. One note read, "If the shepherd steals from the flock, the sheep suffer in silence." And in the margin beside that, accountability to God first, then to the people. I didn't say anything for a moment, just stood up, still holding the book, my mind racing through every sermon, every strange look from Harold and George, every mention of my father's anguish in the final days. "Is this book available to borrow?" I asked casually, turning to the staffer. He looked surprised. We'd need to log it, but yeah, I guess. Could you check it out for me?" He nodded and led me back to the lobby, recorded the title in a ledger, and wrote my name beside it in looping cursive. I thanked him and turned to leave. Oh, I added, as I remembered, I was also supposed to pick up a take-home communion set for a sick boy in the hospital. Okay, 1 second. He disappeared through a side door, presumably heading toward the sacristy. I waited in the hallway, my father's notebook under one arm, the financial book under the other. I opened the borrowed one again and reread the notes. It was all there, subtle but damning, a quiet protest written in the margins of a church textbook. My father had found something, or someone, and now that I had this book, I wasn't so sure I was supposed to. Footsteps returned, and the staffer handed me a small cloth bag. Inside were the tiny communion cups and wafer packets I remembered helping Dad assemble. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "No problem at all," he replied. "Pastor Harold and Reverend George should be back soon. They were out at the cemetery doing blessings." That made me pause. "Blessings?" I asked. He nodded. "Grave blessings. Kind of a tradition here. They do it now and then, especially this time of year." "This late?" "Yeah, I guess so. I was in the cellar before you came in, so I'm not sure when they left." I thanked him again, stepped outside into the crisp evening air, and stood there a moment. From the edge of the parking lot, you could just see the cemetery beyond the tree line. A pair of figures moved between the gravestones. I squinted. Shovels. One of them had a shovel. The other held something that looked a lot like a duffel bag. A bag, just like the one found under the stump. My stomach twisted. They weren't doing blessings. They were hiding something. Again, I didn't go to my car. Not right away. Instead, I took a detour across the church lot, through the side gate and into the grassy field that led toward the cemetery. My shoes were too quiet for comfort, and I tried not to snap twigs as I moved. Not that I had any real plan, just a growing unease in my chest and a borrowed book clutched too tightly under one arm. I kept to the shadows, ducking behind a low wall, squinting across the dim space. There they were, Pastor Harold and Reverend George, not praying, not holding hymnals, not performing blessings. George had a shovel in hand, the blade already coated with fresh soil. Harold stood next to a low mound of disturbed dirt, gripping what looked like an old cloth bag, the kind you bury things in if you don't want them found. I took a slow breath, stepped out from behind the wall, and called out like a man who absolutely wasn't sneaking through gravestones 5 seconds earlier. "Good evening." They jumped. Actually jumped. I watched both of their heads whip toward me like kids caught smoking behind the gym. Marcus Harold's voice cracked as he spoke. "What? What are you doing back here? I forgot something at the library," I said evenly, stepping closer. "Also came back to pick up communion for a boy in the hospital." George stiffened. "You followed us?" "Didn't have to. The cemetery's visible from the side window. Anyone could see you." Harold cleared his throat. We were just blessing an old pet grave. A member's dog. We got permission to move the remains. Space is getting tight. A dog grave. At night with a shovel, sure. I didn't call them out on it directly. Not yet. I looked at the mound of soil again, then glanced at the shovel at the bag. That's quite a bit of dirt, I said. Harold gave a tight smile. Large dog, I nodded. In that bag, George hesitated. Just soil. I stared at the bag, then at both of them. I didn't believe a word. Not because I had proof yet, but because something in their eyes had changed. That casual calm I remembered from Sunday services, it was gone, replaced by a sort of twitchy restraint, like they were waiting for a shoe to drop. Then Harold's eyes flicked to the book under my arm. You borrowed something, he asked too casually. Yeah, I held it up. Church Financial Management and Stewardship. Found it on the top shelf, has some familiar handwriting in the margins. George's shoulders went rigid. Your father read that book too, Harold said, voice carefully neutral. Yeah, I replied. And he took notes, a lot of them, some erased, some still visible. Silence. I could almost hear the oxygen leave the cemetery. I should get going, I did, turning toward the path. I promised that boy I'd bring him communion. They didn't stop me, just stood there still as gravestones watching me leave. And I felt their eyes on my back the entire way. I didn't drive straight to the hospital. Not yet. I drove 2 blocks, then parked near the edge of town and waited. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, I saw it. A car pulling out of the cemetery's back access road. Low headlights, slow speed. Reverend George behind the wheel. The bag, that bag, tucked in the back seat. Shovel sticking out of the trunk like a giant flag of guilt. I followed. Not too close. Just enough to keep him in sight. His taillights turned down a road that led away from town, out into the forested hills. The same direction the police had found the Adidas bag. And that was enough for me. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only number I trusted now. Detective Miller, came the voice after 2 rings. It's Marcus Freeman, I said. I think I'm witnessing something. Important. Her tone changed immediately. Talk to me. I'm following Reverend George. He's headed into the forest. Says he was moving a dog's grave earlier, but I saw the bag. It's not a dog. Silence. Then, Mr. Freeman, I need you to turn around and let us handle this. I can't, I said. Not yet, please. Just send someone to back me up. Another pause. Fine, stay back. Keep eyes on him and don't get out of the car. Tell me exactly where you are. As I gave her my location, George's car turned off the main road and followed a dirt path toward a scenic overlook. I recognized it. Eagle Point Lookout, a place with a wooden viewing platform that overlooked the cliff and river below. Beautiful in the day, terrifying at night. He's pulling into the lookout, I said. I'm about 100 yards behind. Officers are en route. 10 minutes out. I killed my headlights and eased to a stop behind a stand of trees. George stepped out of his car, slipped on a headlamp, and retrieved the bag and shovel. Then he headed down the narrow trail toward the lower platform near the cliff's edge. That was all I needed to see. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, ignoring Detective Miller's warnings echoing through the speaker, and followed. The lower platform creaked under my feet. George was already there, kneeling, unpacking the bag. He looked up as I approached, his face pale and strained under the headlamp. You shouldn't be here, he said. I stepped into the light. And you shouldn't be dumping bags off cliffs. He didn't deny it, just stared at me, then said low and brittle, don't you know what? Don't pretend. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. The bag sat at George's feet, partially open. I could see books inside, dusty, water-stained, wrapped in a cloth. Sermon notes, in a diary. My stomach turned. You found them, I whispered. He said nothing. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to rise. You called the police? George snapped. I promised the truth to a sick boy in a hospital bed, I said, and to myself. You're just the unfortunate detour. He stared at the bag, then at the cliff, and suddenly he bolted, not toward me, but toward the railing. No, I shouted, lunging forward. But before he could leap, 2 officers came tearing down the trail, grabbing him just in time and yanking him back from the edge. He screamed, struggled, but they held on. You don't get to run, one officer said grimly. You get to face what you did. I looked at the bag still lying on the wooden planks, and as I knelt to open it, I knew. The past wasn't buried anymore. It was staring back. The lights from the patrol cars flickered red and blue across the treetops, casting strange shadows down the trail. Reverend George was handcuffed and seated on the back bumper of a cruiser flanked by two officers. He looked like the night had already aged him another decade, his hands trembling, his eyes vacant. All that controlled calm I remembered from my youth, the rehearsed wisdom from the pulpit, gone. What remained was just an old man with nowhere left to hide. Detective Miller arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of her unmarked vehicle like a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to get results. She walked straight over to me where I sat beside the open bag on the wooden trail. "Well," she said, looking down at the contents, "you were right to call." Inside the bag were two books, one larger, one narrow, both wrapped in grave-dusted cloth. One was my father's missing 1977 sermon notebook, the other his personal diary. Both were worn but unmistakably his, and I felt something crack open in my chest just seeing them again. Grief relief. I honestly couldn't tell. There was also a clear zippered pouch with what appeared to be bone fragments, small discolored pieces mixed with soil. "I think we found him," I said quietly. Detective Miller knelt beside me. "We'll have to send it for analysis, of course, but yes, I believe this is your father." The wind picked up, tugging at the pages of the notebook. She motioned for her team to photograph and collect the items. I stood back as gloved hands lifted my father's final writings from the bag, treating them like holy relics, which honestly they kind of were. In the middle of it all, George sat silently. His lips moved slightly like he was praying, or bargaining. I wasn't sure which. Miller walked over and crouched in front of him. "Where were you taking the bag?" she asked, voice even. George stared at the ground, away. "Why now?" She started asking questions again, he said, eyes flicking toward me. "The book was found. The writing. It was all unraveling." "What were you trying to hide?" she asked gently. George's voice broke. "Everything." And just like that, the dam burst, he confessed. Not in loud proclamations or dramatic gestures, just a slow, steady release of truth. Like a man emptying out poison, one sentence at a time. He and Harold had been embezzling from the church, starting small in 1975, then growing bolder. Reverend Elijah Freeman, my father, had discovered it in early 1907. At first, he'd approached them privately, gave them a chance to confess, to repent. They refused. So my father told them he would bring it before the congregation. That Friday night, April 22nd, they met him at the church under the guise of reconciliation. An argument started in the basement office, and it never made it upstairs. "He wouldn't stop," George said. He wouldn't let us lie anymore." Miller didn't move. George wiped at his face. "We didn't plan to kill him. We just wanted to scare him. But then it happened. It just happened." I closed my eyes. "You ever feel like you're falling without moving?" That's what it felt like then. They wrapped the body in one of the old sacristy robes and buried him in the church cemetery beneath an unused pet plot, marked only by a fake plaque and years of silence. A spot no one would bother to revisit, then afraid someone might find his belongings and connect them to the scene they packed his robe and Bible in that vintage Adidas bag along with his journal and sermon notes. They paid a local man long since moved out of town to dig a hole under a felled tree stump deep in the woods. Said it was for private family belongings. Paid him in frage, told no one. The evidence was split body under one grave, the truth buried miles away. Two graves, one man. Harold, according to George, had been the one to erase my father's marginalia in the stewardship book. Thought that would be enough. Thought no one would ever find it. Why now? Miller asked again, "Why move it tonight?" George shook his head, looking exhausted. "Because I saw him," he whispered, nodding toward me. And I knew he knew. Back at the station, they brought Harold in from his home. No drama. Just an officer knocking on a door and saying it was time. I watched them walk him down the hallway in handcuffs. He looked straight at me. Didn't say a word, just blinked. Slowly. Like it was the first time he'd really seen me. Miller and I moved to an evidence room where technicians were carefully processing the recovered items. She handed me gloves and asked me to confirm each one. The sermon notebook dated January to April 1907 with my father's name embossed in fading gold. The diary, leather-bound, water-damaged, but still intact enough to identify. And finally, the pouch of bone fragments. I almost couldn't speak. We'll run full DNA testing, Miller said softly. But based on what George has told us, we have every reason to believe this is your father. I nodded. That was all I could manage. One of the forensic techs opened the diary, gently peeling apart the least damaged pages. Most were swollen and illegible, but toward the middle, a single page had dried just enough to reveal handwriting. It read, "The truth is heavy, but I must carry it, even if no one believes me, even if it costs everything. God sees all." Another officer spoke up. "Pastor Harold still won't talk, denies everything." Miller folded her arms. "He will." I stepped away from the table, walked into the hallway and leaned against the wall. This wasn't the ending, but it was the beginning of it. My father hadn't run, hadn't abandoned his faith. He had died doing exactly what he'd taught me, stand for truth even when it stands alone. And now, after 25 years, the silence was over. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. By the time I left the station, the sun was crawling back up over the ridge. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and yet I felt like I was seeing the town for the first time, as if the map had changed, same roads, different names. Same church, different history. My own life reframed by a truth I hadn't been ready to carry until now. Instead of going home, I drove to the diner. That's the thing about small town diners. They're always open, always smell like burnt toast and old coffee, and always have that one waitress who's been there longer than the booths. This one was named June, same as ever. She didn't recognize me, which was honestly a relief. "Coffee?" she asked. "Absolutely," I said. And for the first time in over 2 decades, I sat with my father's diary on a Formica table, sipping bitter coffee and flipping through water-warped pages like they were sacred scripture. Most of the entries were ruined ink, blurred into loops and spirals, but others were legible. One read, "Harold and George continue to deny." But the numbers are clear. I've double-checked the ledgers twice now. I prayed last night until my knees ached. Still no peace. Another, "If they do not repent, I will bring it before the congregation next Sunday." I dread the confrontation. But silence now is equal to betrayal. I had to stop reading. I was in a booth in a diner surrounded by retired couples and construction crews ordering eggs, and I was on the verge of tears, which is not ideal in a place with this much flannel. A few minutes later, June brought a plate of toast I didn't order. "You look like someone who could use it," she said, sliding it across the table. She wasn't wrong. That afternoon, I returned to the hospital. I had promised Robbie I'd come back with communion. And honestly, that promise felt more important now than ever. Not just for him, but for me. The front desk waved me through when I explained who I was. I found him sitting up in bed, looking pale but significantly less glassy-eyed than the day before. His aunt sat nearby, her arms folded, like she still wasn't sure if I was a blessing or a liability. "Hey," I said, stepping into the room. "Brought what I promised." Robbie's eyes lit up. The little cups, I smiled and pulled the cloth bag from my coat. The very same. His aunt looked uncertain. "We're not religious." I nodded. "That's okay. I'm not sure I am either. But your sister Robbie's mom believed in this. And sometimes honoring that is enough." She didn't stop me. I unpacked the communion elements, tiny pre-filled cups and small wafers in sealed packets. It looked more like airplane food than sacred ritual, but it had meaning. I placed them on the tray table, then sat beside Robbie's bed. My dad used to say I began that communion isn't about perfection. It's about presence, about remembering that God sits with us even when we feel alone. Robbie tilted his head. "Even when we're sick." "Especially then. There's something strange about walking through the halls of a police station while holding your father's sermon notebook. Like you've snuck in a sacred object where it doesn't belong." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The walls were beige. Everything smelled faintly of coffee and toner paper. But in my hands was a piece of 1907, my father's handwriting, his theology, his conscience. Detective Miller let me take a private moment in one of the side rooms. I sat alone with the sermon notebook, the spine cracked and stained, the pages yellowed but solid. His handwriting hadn't changed. Same slant, same habit of writing scripture references in the margins, like footnotes for future arguments. I flipped through week by week. January's sermons were uplifting. New Year messages, hope, renewal. February, still optimistic, but more serious. By March, something shifted. The tone turned heavier, more cautionary, themes of betrayal, integrity, warnings about leaders losing sight of their flock. It was subtle at first, like a background hum of doubt. But the April entries, those were different. April 3rd, a shepherd who sees the wolves and does nothing is no better than the wolves themselves. April 10th, financial purity is spiritual purity. Theft is rot in the walls of a church. April 17th, I will not name names, not yet, but God knows. April 22nd, his last recorded sermon draft. Just a few lines. Sunday's message day, Matthew 18:15-17. If a brother sins, go and tell him his fault. If he will not hear you, bring one or two more. If he refuses, even then, tell it to the church. And scrawled underneath, I pray they repent before I must go public. I stared at that last line for a long time. This wasn't just theology. This was a plan, a pastor preparing to confront his own church leadership according to Scripture and with every opportunity for grace. He was giving them time, and they used it to bury him. I stood, notebook still open in my hands, when the door opened. It was Miller. You ready? She asked. I nodded, though I wasn't. Has George said anything else? She shook her head. He's been crying off and on, keeps saying, I thought it was the only way. And Harold's still pretending none of it happened. But we found shovel marks over the original grave. Someone had disturbed it recently. That plus George's statement is enough for now. I followed her down the hall to a viewing room. Behind the glass, George sat alone at a table. His hands were folded. He looked like a man praying for time he'd already run out of. I stared at him through the glass. Why now? I asked again. After 25 years, Gilt Miller said. That kind of secret doesn't stay quiet forever. It rots, same way mold spreads in a house. He probably thought if he moved the evidence, he could start sleeping again. Do you think my father ever suspected they might kill him? I think he feared it. But from what I've read in that notebook, she looked at me. He hoped they'd change instead. I closed the notebook. He was a better man than most. Miller's phone buzzed. She answered, listened for a moment, then nodded and hung up. That was the lab, she said. Preliminary analysis of the bone fragments matches a male in his 40s, African-American, consistent with your father's profile. They'll need data from a close relative to confirm. I can give that, I said. Whatever they need. She hesitated, then reached into her jacket and handed me a clear bag. Inside was a thin paper, the corner of a sermon page torn clean. On it were 3 words handwritten in the same script I now recognized without doubt. Tell the truth. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't even capitalized, but it hit like scripture. I drove home that night in silence, didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone. Just kept one hand on the wheel and one on the cloth bag that now held my father's recovered notebook and the financial book from the church library. I hadn't eaten all day, didn't feel hungry. My mind was too full. There's a strange kind of aging that happens when you uncover long-buried truths. Your face doesn't change, but your soul feels like it just skipped a decade. That's wisdom, I guess. Aging doesn't always come from birthdays. Sometimes it comes from knowing. And tonight I knew what it meant to inherit a burden and carry it anyway. When I got home, the apartment was still, dim, that post-2 a.m. kind of quiet where every sound feels personal. I set the books on the coffee table, washed my face, and sat down on the floor. Then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I prayed, not out loud, not kneeling, just a whisper inside my head, a kind of truce, not forgiveness, not yet, but a reopening of the line. I said, if you're there, thanks for not letting me forget that notebook. That's when I realized something odd. The communion set, still in the car. I had promised Robbie I'd bring it back. And in the madness of the pursuit, the confrontation, the confessions, I'd forgotten again. I checked my phone, missed call from the hospital. Voicemail, I tapped play. It was a nurse. Mr. Freeman, Robbie's asking for you. He's feeling better, but says he wants to see you. Also, his family's arrived. His family. Right. The aunt and uncle who don't like him. I didn't know what kind of reunion that would be. But I knew I owed the kid more than a promise. And communion, it seemed, was the least I could bring. The hospital at night is its own kind of church. Dim lights, whispered voices, a strange hush that even machines respect. You walk slower in hospitals, speak softer even if you're not told to, like something sacred or tragic might be happening one hallway over. When I stepped off the elevator onto the pediatric floor, the nurse at the desk smiled at me. "You're Mr. Freeman." I nodded. "He's been waiting. Room 212 just down the hall. His aunt and uncle are with him." I held up the cloth bag containing the take-home communion. "I promised him." She smiled again, but this time with something behind her eyes, curiosity maybe, or admiration, or just the quiet exhaustion of someone who's seen too many promises broken in a building like this. I thanked her and walked the hall, footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Room 212 had its door cracked open. Inside, a dull glow came from the TV tuned to one of those late-night nature documentaries where British men talk about Arctic foxes like they're royalty. Robbie sat up in bed, thinner than I remembered from the cemetery, but with more color in his face. His aunt and uncle sat nearby looking tense, the kind of tension that comes from guilt, I think, or maybe embarrassment. I knocked softly and stepped in. "Evening." Robbie's eyes lit up. "You came back." "Of course I did," I said, setting the cloth bag on the table. "I made a promise, didn't I?" The aunt stood up. "We were just about to leave. Visiting hours are over." The nurse at the desk peeked in behind me. "We're giving them a few more minutes," she said gently. "Special circumstance." They stayed, mostly because the nurse did. I opened the bag and took out the communion set. It wasn't fancy, just small, sealed cups of grape juice and plastic-wrapped wafers, but Robbie stared at it like it was gold. I glanced at the aunt and uncle. "Would you like to join us?" They hesitated, then nodded. I washed my hands in the sink, then laid everything out on the little rolling table that hospitals pretend can hold real meals. And for the first time in 25 years, I led communion. Not because I was ordained, not because I felt holy, but because something in that room needed to be healed, and I couldn't wait for someone else to show up with a collar and a cross. I cleared my throat and spoke voice low. This was something my father used to do for the sick. He'd bring communion to people who couldn't make it to church. I helped him sometimes. I was just a kid, but I remember what he said. Robbie watched me carefully. I continued. He'd say, "It's not about ritual, it's about memory. We take this to remember who we are and who God still is even when things are broken." I handed out the wafers and cups. We bowed our heads. And for 30 quiet seconds, 4 very different people in a tiny fluorescent hospital room shared something bigger than juice and bread. We remembered. We hoped. And in my case, at least, we started healing. Afterward, Robbie leaned back against his pillow. "I feel better," he said. Not physically, his eyes said something deeper, calmer. His aunt was watching me closely now. "You're Reverend Freeman's son, aren't you?" I nodded. "I am. I remember your father. I was a girl, but I remember his voice. He baptized my cousin in the river." Her voice cracked a little. "What happened to him was wrong," she added, eyes dropping. We all knew something wasn't right, but no one did anything. I didn't know what to say to that. Sometimes silence is the only honest reply. "I'd like to visit your church again," she said softly. "Me too," her husband muttered. That caught me off guard, but I only nodded. "You'd be welcome." They left a few minutes later, thanking me again. The nurse smiled as they passed her. Then it was just me and Robbie in the room. He looked at me with those too wise for his age eyes. "Are you going to keep coming back?" I sat on the edge of the bed. "I don't know yet. Your dad was a good pastor, right?" "The best I knew," I said. "He told the truth, even when it hurt." Robbie nodded solemnly. "I want to be like that." "Then you're already halfway there." We sat for a while longer. He dozed off eventually, the way kids do when they know someone's still there. I slipped out quietly. Back in the hallway, the nurse from earlier caught me before I reached the elevator. "That was beautiful," she said. I wasn't sure I remembered all the words. I replied. "You remembered the ones that mattered." I almost smiled. As I stepped outside into the cool air, the stars were still out sharp and clear above the hospital roof. And something strange happened. I felt okay. Not fixed, not healed, but okay. And for the first time in years, I whispered something out loud. "Thanks, Dad." There was no thunder, no vision, no dramatic sign, just the rustle of leaves in the trees behind the building. But that was enough. The next morning, I returned to the church, not to interrogate, not to search, but to listen. It was early. The sun hadn't fully cleared the tree line yet, and the stained glass windows of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist glowed dull and sleepy. not yet awake with color. I parked under the same oak tree I used to ride my bike past as a kid, back when Sunday morning was a routine, not a ghost story. I had the sermon notebook under my arm again. It felt heavier today. Inside the building was empty except for one person, the young staff member from earlier, the one who had helped me find the notebook. He was vacuuming the aisle carpet earbuds in mouthing lyrics to something upbeat. When he saw me, he paused, yanked one earbud out, and smiled. Back again, I held up the notebook. Yeah, I wanted to go through a few more things. Hope that's okay. Of course, he said. You can use the library or your father's old office. Pastor Harold and Reverend George. Well, they're not coming in today. I raised an eyebrow. He looked slightly sheepish. I heard they were both arrested last night. Word travels fast in a small church. Seems like everyone's hearing it now, I said. He didn't ask why, just nodded and went back to vacuuming. I walked past the pews, taking in the silence. It was strange being here without the cloud of suspicion pressing on my chest. The very walls felt different now, like they could breathe again. I made my way into the library and laid the notebook on the table where I'd left it days earlier. The other books had been returned to their shelves. Everything was tidy, too tidy really, like someone had tried to clean away history, but history doesn't clean easy. I opened the sermon book to the last entry again. If a brother sins against you, go and tell him. It struck me again how my father had planned to follow the very scripture the men who killed him likely used every Sunday. That's the thing about faith. People can twist it, weaponize it, but the truth underneath doesn't go away. It just waits. And my father, he didn't use scripture to protect himself. He used it to confront, to redeem. That's rare, more rare than it should be. I spent a while copying out notes from the journal and the sermon book. Details I wanted to remember, phrases that stood out. One of them, justice isn't vengeance, it's restoration. That one stopped me, because if that's true, if justice isn't about punishment, but about setting things right, then I had work to do, not just with police, not just with books, but with people. Around midday, I drove out to the church cemetery, not for confrontation this time, for goodbye. The police had cordoned off the area around the dog grave, which we now knew wasn't for a dog at all. There was yellow tape, a tent, forensic tools, and quietly spoken words. They were careful, respectful. Detective Miller met me at the edge. They'll be transferring the remains this afternoon, she said. Once we get DNA confirmation, they'll be released to you. Thank you, I said. For everything, she hesitated, then asked, you ever think about preaching again? I almost laughed. I don't think I ever started. You have your father's voice, she said. Hope I use it better than he did, I muttered. Then stopped myself. No, that's not fair. He used it right. The world just didn't listen. Miller looked at the tent. They'll listen now. We stood in silence. There's something humbling about watching people in hazmat suits handle your father's bones, even 25 years later, even when you knew it was coming. I thought about the funeral he never got, the eulogies that were never spoken, the legacy left to rot under 2 feet of dirt and 2 decades of silence. It was time to fix that. I told Miller I wanted to host a memorial service, here, at the church, for the people who remembered him, for the ones who didn't, and maybe most of all, for me. That night I sat on my apartment floor with the financial book again, the one I'd borrowed, the one my father had scribbled in like it was a confession booth. I turned to the heavily marked page again, the one about stewardship and accountability. That quirky academic phrase came back to me. Spiritual economies depend on moral currency. We used to laugh about phrases like that when I was a teen. Sounded like someone trying too hard to make theology sound like economics. But now I saw what it meant. A church isn't just a building, it's a ledger. Not of dollars, but of trust. And the moment leaders forget that, everything starts to rot. My father tried to balance that ledger, and he paid for it with his life. But now I was holding the receipts. Sunday came quicker than I expected. It had been just 4 days since the police dug up the truth, 4 days since the bones were recovered, the diary resurfaced, and the facade of Mount Olive finally cracked wide open. But in a town like this, word spreads like fire in dry grass. By 9 a.m., people were already gathering outside the church. Some I recognized older now, but still carrying the same purses and Sunday coats. Others were strangers, young adults, teenagers, even some kids who clearly didn't understand what was going on, just that their parents had dressed them up and dragged them to something important. I stood by the front doors, notebook in hand, nodding silently to each person who passed. Many offered quiet condolences. Some looked confused. A few, particularly the older men, looked deeply uncomfortable. Guilt, maybe, or regret. Pastor Harold was nowhere to be seen. George was already in custody. And me. Well, I had apparently inherited the pulpit, at least for the morning. I didn't sit in the pews. I stood at the back until the sanctuary was mostly full. Then, when it was clear no one else was going to speak, I walked slowly to the front and stepped behind the pulpit where my father had once stood. The same wood, the same microphone. I cleared my throat and adjusted it slightly. "Good morning," I began. There was a strange hush. No coughing, no murmurs. Even the children were quiet. "I don't have a sermon. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a prophet. I'm just a son." Pause, Mayatu. My name is Marcus Freeman. Most of you know that. Most of you knew my father, Reverend Elijah Freeman. There were nods. A few amens whispered like habits. I've been gone from this church for a long time, and I never thought I'd step foot in here again. Not after what happened. Not after he disappeared. And certainly not after all the rumors. I opened the notebook and held it up. This is my father's final sermon book, from 1907, the year he vanished. I let that sit, let the weight of it fill the space. For years, people said he ran, that he left, that he couldn't handle the pressure, or maybe he had secrets. But none of that was true. I felt my voice tighten, but I didn't stop. He was killed, murdered, by the very men he worked alongside, because he discovered that this church the leadership was stealing. And when he tried to speak up, they silenced him. Gasps, hands over mouths. A woman in the second row started crying quietly. I took a breath. But my father didn't die afraid. Dawn. He didn't die bitter. He died trying to do what was right, trying to live the gospel he preached every week, even when it hurt, even when it was lonely. I opened to one of the pages and read aloud, "If we confront evil with love, we risk pain. But if we refuse to confront it at all, we become part of it." I let that sit, then looked up. This church has a decision to make. You can bury this again, pretend it didn't happen, go back to business as usual, or you can face it, clean house, apologize, and become the kind of church my father believed in. I closed the notebook and stepped back from the mic. No applause, no music, just silence. And then someone stood up, an older man. I didn't recognize him at first, but then I remembered his face from the old choir photos. He'd always been quiet, never one to speak. I knew he said quietly, not everything, but something was wrong. I saw them talking in hushed voices that Friday night. I didn't ask. His voice cracked. I should have asked. Others stood too, admitted they'd heard rumors, felt something, but chose to believe the neat version instead, the one where my father just walked away. By the end of it, more than a dozen people were on their feet, and for the first time I felt what restoration could look like. Not just truth revealed, but truth received. After the service, a few people stayed behind. They asked to see the sermon notebook, held it like it was holy. Some even asked me to read more passages aloud. One woman, a former Sunday school teacher, whispered, "He was always gentle, but he was never weak." I nodded. He taught me that strength doesn't always raise its voice. Later, as people filtered out, the young church staffer found me in the hallway. "We're planning a permanent memorial," he said. "Would you speak at it?" I thought about that for a long moment. Maybe I said, "But only if it's not just about grief." He tilted his head. "What else would it be?" "About courage," I said, "and what it costs." That evening, I visited the cemetery again. The grave had been properly marked now, a simple plaque, not permanent yet, but respectful. Reverend Elijah Freeman, 1934 to 1977. Faithful servant, truth teller. I sat on the grass like I had when I was 17. Same tree overhead, same breeze rustling the oak leaves. But I wasn't a teenager anymore, and I wasn't alone. I opened the notebook and read a few pages aloud. Just the parts that felt right, the parts that reminded me he was still my father, not just a mystery. As I read, I thought about something he used to say when life got overwhelming. "God doesn't always stop the storm, Marcus. But sometimes he gives you better shoes. I chuckled softly. Well, Dad, your son finally laced them up. 2 days later, I received a call from Detective Miller. DNA results are in, she said. It's official. The remains are your father's. I'd known, of course, the moment I saw the handwriting, the robe, the pages soaked with time. But hearing it confirm science catching up with instinct still hit me harder than I expected. Thank you, I said. I appreciate everything. We're closing the case, she said, but you've reopened something bigger than a file, Marcus. Just thought you should know. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a while. The world didn't change around me. No light broke through the clouds. No music swelled. But something shifted inside. I felt it. The weight that had pressed down on my family for 25 years, it had a name now, a shape, a history. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was truth, and it could finally be carried. I spent the rest of the morning flipping through my father's diary again. The parts we could recover were mostly from the spring of 1970. The handwriting grew increasingly sharp toward the end, like each word had to carve its way out. There were theological reflections, thoughts on prayer lines from sermons in progress. But buried in the pages, I found something unexpected. A list. 3 names, each with a small annotation. George Langston, funds misused, denial. Harold Whitmore, avoids questioning, evasive. Tommy Willis, resigns suddenly after questioning. Wait, that last name, Tommy Willis, I remembered him faintly. Maintenance guy always in the background. Kept the boiler running, mowed the lawn. Hadn't been seen in town in decades. I took a photo of the page and sent it to Miller with a simple text. Who is Tommy Willis and where did he go? A few hours later, she responded, left town in late '77, bought property in Oklahoma under a new name. We're looking into it. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it was clear. There were still echoes of this story in places I hadn't explored. That evening, I returned to the hospital one last time. Robbie was being discharged. His aunt and uncle were there, quieter now, less performative. They thanked me again this time without the layer of awkwardness. Robbie gave me a hug that felt more like a promise than a goodbye. You coming back to church? He asked. I might. I said, will you bring the communion again? Next time I'll make sure I don't forget it. He grinned, eyes already brighter. As they left, I handed his aunt a small envelope. Inside was a photo of my father with the church choir taken in 1976. She looked at it for a long time. We'll hang this in the house, she said, so Robbie knows the kind of man who helped him. I nodded, unsure how to respond to that kind of full-circle kindness. After they left, I walked the quiet halls of the hospital one more time. I passed rooms with sleeping patients, tired nurses, soft monitor beeps echoing down sterile corridors. The place that had once felt cold now felt sacred in a quiet, tired sort of way. A place where healing, real healing, didn't wear robes or collars. It just showed up and stayed. The next day I met with church leadership, what remained of it. With Harold and George gone, the church board was made up of a few elders and long-retired deacons. They looked uncomfortable, like men who had inherited a crumbling building they didn't know how to fix. We want to name the fellowship hall after your father, one said. That's kind, I replied, but not enough. They blinked. I continued. This church needs to confess, publicly, not just to what happened, but to how it was allowed to happen. You don't need to explain away the past. You need to own it. There was silence. Then slowly one nodded. We'll do what's right, he said. Finally, I left without making a scene. No need. The scene had already played itself out. Now it was time for quiet work. That night, I found myself back in my father's study, well, my version of it. The spare room in my apartment where all his books still lived. The place I'd ignored for so long now felt like the heart of the whole story. I lit a candle. Not out of ritual, really. Just stillness. I sat on the floor surrounded by sermon notes, his old commentaries, in the now sacred 1977 notebook. I held the final entry again. Read it out loud. If I disappear, let it be for truth. That one sentence said more than any police report ever could. And suddenly I knew. It wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about inheritance, not property, not money, but the kind of inheritance that rewires your bones. Legacy and responsibility. I whispered, I hear you, Dad. Then I closed the notebook gently, like tucking someone in. The storm hadn't passed, but the house was still standing, and the foundation solid as ever. It was a Friday evening when I finally visited the church basement. Not for evidence, not for investigation, just because. It had taken me this long to build up the nerve. For most of my life, that part of the church was just a utility space, cool and dim, full of folding chairs and old choir robes, a place where hot water pipes knocked and secrets settled like dust. But now, after everything, it had become something else, a crime scene. The officers had already completed their work. Forensics had packed up markers, removed tape peeled from corners. The congregation didn't talk about what had happened down here. Most pretended it was a place best forgotten. But I couldn't forget. I stepped down slowly. The wooden stairs creaked under to my feet, same as always. At the bottom, the storage lights flickered on, with a delay casting that familiar yellow glow over concrete floors and metal shelving units. It smelled the same cleaner old wood, something vaguely like chalk, but the space felt smaller now, heavier. I walked to the spot George had described during his confession, just beside the old furnace closet where extra pulpits and Christmas props were kept. The floor was smooth now, resealed. But if you knew what to look for, you could see a faint discoloration where the concrete had been disturbed. I stood there for a long time, not praying, not crying, just remembering. I pictured my father, tall, always calm, always composed. I tried to imagine him down here that night, standing his ground, speaking the truth, knowing what it might cost. That takes a kind of strength most men never learn. Not loud strength, quiet strength, the kind that breaks cycles without breaking people. I whispered, "You didn't run." I hoped he heard it wherever he was. Back upstairs, I found the young staff member, Jason. I'd finally learned his name prepping for Sunday service. "Mind if I ask you something?" I said, leaning against the doorway of the media booth. He looked up. Of course, if someone wanted to start over here, but like really rebuild this place from the inside out. "Where would you begin?" He smiled without hesitation. "With the truth. Smart kid." I nodded. "Mind if I stick around a little longer? Maybe help out with the audio tomorrow." His eyebrows lifted. "You want to volunteer?" "Maybe. Call it penance." Jason grinned. "Then yeah, absolutely, we could use the help." That night, I sat with my father's diary again. The middle section, April, was still the most intact. And as I carefully separated two water-warped pages, I discovered something I hadn't seen before. A handwritten letter. Folded twice, tucked in, probably intended for someone he never got to meet. The top read simply, "To my son." My heart stopped. The handwriting was shaky, as if he'd been writing in a rush or in distress. But the words were clear. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I hope I'm alive. I hope we've already talked about this in person. But if not, if I disappeared, if something happened to me, please know this. I tried to handle things the right way. I gave them chances. I showed them mercy. I confronted them in private, as the scriptures say. But the truth must not be buried with me. I had to stop reading for a moment. Just breathe. Then I continued. "You are not responsible for my choices, but you will carry their consequences. That's the unfair part of legacy. But I hope you also inherit my conviction. Not to judge, but to heal. You will want revenge. Please don't choose that. Choose light. Choose justice. And never let fear write your story." He signed it with love and hope. Dad, it wasn't a goodbye, it was a charge. And I felt it settle on my shoulders like a cloak I hadn't realized I was already wearing. The next day, I returned to the church, not for answers, but to help set up chairs. A few other volunteers showed up. Jason handed me a clipboard. We spent the morning untangling mic cables and organizing hymnals. It was small work, mundane, but it felt sacred. At one point, a little girl ran through the sanctuary chasing a paper airplane. It landed near my feet. I picked it up and handed it back. She looked up at me and asked, "Are you the pastor now?" I smiled. "No, sweetie, I'm just the guy setting up chairs." She squinted. "You look like a pastor." "I sound like one too," Jason muttered nearby. I shook my head. "No sermons today. I'm off duty." But deep down I knew. This was the beginning of something. Not a ministry, not a legacy revival tour, just healing. and maybe eventually faith. The memorial service was set for the following Sunday. Not a funeral, my father had never been given one. No casket, no procession, no folded flag, just 25 years of silence and half-spoken speculation. This was something else, something overdue. The church had printed simple programs, a photo of him smiling in his robe, the caption reading, "In memory of Reverend Elijah Freeman, 1934 to 1977, found but never forgotten." I stood in the back before the service began watching people fill the pews again. More than I expected. Former members, folks from other churches, even some from out of town who remembered my father's radio broadcasts from the early 70s. Jason was managing the audio booth. He gave me a thumbs up across the room. I nodded, and then I saw her. A woman in her late 60s, neatly dressed with sharp eyes and a slight limp, walking down the aisle with a grace that ignored age. Detective Sarah Miller. Not in uniform, just attending. I met her halfway and shook her hand. "Didn't expect to see you. Didn't expect to be invited," she replied. "But I figured if I helped you find the truth, I should be here to help honor it." We sat in the front row. When the choir began to sing soft hymns my father used to hum while washing dishes, I felt something inside me loosen. A kind of knot I hadn't realized was still tied. Then they handed me the mic. I walked up to the pulpit again, but this time not to speak about murder, or theft, or hidden graves. This time I spoke about life. My father wasn't a perfect man, I said. He wasn't always patient. He used too much salt on his eggs. He argued with my teachers when I got detention. Light chuckles. But he was the same man on Sunday as he was on Wednesday. And that's rare. He believed in integrity even when it made him unpopular. And when he saw injustice, he didn't walk away. I looked around the room. Old faces, wet eyes, people holding hands. He taught me something without saying it outright, I continued. He taught me that legacy isn't about how many people clap when you're speaking. It's about who still hears your voice when you're gone. I paused, holding the mic lower for a moment. Even when they tried to bury his voice, it came back. Through words, through truth, through all of you who showed up today. I stepped back, and the congregation stood, not out of obligation, but because they felt it. Because some voices don't go silent when they die, they just change frequency. Later, as people trickled out into the sunlight, Miller stood beside me on the church steps. "You did good," she said. "I didn't think I would. You did better than most." Then she handed me something, a small envelope. "What's this, a letter?" "From the state lab, final DNA confirmation, and an official statement of cause of death." I held it for a second, then slipped it into my jacket pocket without opening it. "I already know what it says," I told her. She smiled. I figured. That evening, I drove back to the cemetery. The new grave marker was in place now, polished final, no longer temporary. It bore my father's name, birth and death, years, and beneath that the same 3 words I'd found in his notebook: "Tell the truth." No flowers yet, just freshly packed soil and early summer sun. I knelt down and placed my hand against the warm stone. "I hope you saw it," I said quietly. "All of it." The wind stirred, a bird chirped from a nearby oak, and I imagined for just a moment my father standing beside me again, hands in his pockets, a soft smile on his face. That expression he used to get when I finally figured something out on my own. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because legacy doesn't whisper with voices. It breathes through choices. And I had finally made mine. A week passed, then 2. The world didn't change much. The headlines faded. George and Harold were denied bail awaiting trial. The church board started cleaning house, not just symbolically, but literally. Boxes of financial records were pulled from the storage room. New elders were voted in. Services began with statements of acknowledgement, not just hymns. But the biggest change, I kept showing up. Not to preach, not to lead, just to be present. Some Sundays I sat quietly in the back. Other times I helped set up folding chairs in the fellowship hall or fix the ancient speakers no one had touched since 1994. I even found myself humming through old hymns I hadn't thought about in years. Jason asked once, "Are you coming back for good?" "I'm not sure," I said, "but I'm not leaving." One afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I picked up, the voice on the other end said, "Mr. Freeman, this is the Oklahoma State Police. We think we found Tommy Willis. That name again. The third man on my father's list. The maintenance worker who vanished just after my father died. Alive, I asked. Very much so. He's been living under a new name near Tulsa. Changed identities in 1978. Said he had reasons. I was silent for a moment. Did he know what happened to my father? Yes, the officer said quietly. He was there that night. Not involved in the assault, but he helped bury the body. I felt the room go cold. Did he confess he did? Said it's haunted him every day. He believed your father would want it to be known. He's willing to testify. I wrote down the details, heart racing. Another thread after all this time. Another man who couldn't outrun the truth. The next Sunday, I shared the news with Detective Miller in the church parking lot. She nodded. This just keeps unfolding, doesn't it? Like a bad sermon illustration, I said dryly. She laughed. One that actually sticks. Then her face turned more serious. Are you okay with this? More court dates, more headlines, more digging? I am, I said, because every time we dig, we uncover a little more light. She looked at me for a moment. You sound like your father. Scary, isn't it? Strangely comforting, actually. We stood there for a while, leaning against her car as the congregation filtered in behind us. Then she asked, what are you going to do when this is all over? I thought about the diary, the notebook, the boy in the hospital, the staffers trying to rebuild the congregation, trying to unlearn their own myths. I don't know, I said, but I think it'll involve staying. That evening, I cleaned out the study in my apartment, not to get rid of my father's books, but to move them. I decided to donate half his library to the church, starting a permanent archive in the back of the library. They were planning to turn one of the spare rooms into a reading and prayer space. I wanted his words there, his notes, his voice and mine. Maybe I'd add a few pages of my own one day. I boxed up the oldest volumes first, the ones I'd read as a kid, mostly just to feel smart. One was still marked with my father's handwriting. Marcus, I left you a foundation, not a conclusion. That felt different now, like a blueprint, not a burden. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper written in cursive. You don't know me, Mom, but I knew your father. I was a teenager in 1907. I watched what happened to him. I stayed silent. I'm sorry. I've tried to live differently ever since. I hope you continue the work he started. No signature. Just that. And it was enough, because that's what truth does. It spreads, quietly, relentlessly, like roots beneath concrete. And once it starts to break through, well, there's no stopping it. Not with time, not with lies, not even with death. The trial began in the third week of November. A sharp chill that had settled over Arkansas by then, coats out breath, visible trees stripped bare, except for a few stubborn gold leaves clinging to the tips. The courthouse stood solemn under a flat gray sky, its stone steps looking more like a warning than an invitation. The courtroom was packed, not with protesters or press, though both were there, but with townspeople, congregants, curious old-timers, even folks who hadn't set foot in a church since the Reagan administration. Everyone wanted to know what had really happened that night in 1907, and they were about to find out. The prosecutor walked the jury through every piece of evidence, the Discover robe and Bible, the handwritten notes, the erased names in the stewardship book, the burial beneath the church cemetery under the false dog marker, the confession, and most damning of all, Tommy Willis's sworn testimony. I was called to the stand too. I answered every question slowly, calmly, as if narrating someone else's documentary, except it wasn't someone else's. It was mine. When they asked how I felt discovering my father's remains, I paused and said lighter, like a window opened in a sealed room. The defense tried its best: age, memory loss, stress, old-fashioned church politics. But the truth doesn't go back to sleep once it wakes up. Verdict: guilty. Both counts. Both men. Harold Whitmore and George Langston, once towering figures in the pulpit, now face the rest of their lives behind bars, not for a mistake, but for a conspiracy, for silencing a good man who had the nerve to challenge their greed with scripture. Afterward, I went back to the cemetery. This time I brought company. Robbie. Now out of the hospital and bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, his aunt walked beside him, quietly giving us space. I wanted to see where your dad is, he said. We stood together in front of the grave. He looked up at me and asked, was he scared? That question hit hard. I think he was, I said honestly, but he still did the right thing. That's what made him strong. Robbie nodded, then he did something unexpected. He placed a small wooden cross in the grass. He'd carved it himself, a little crooked, but full of heart. For him, he said. I smiled. He'd like that. That night I spoke at the church again. It wasn't planned. People just gathered. And someone handed me the mic. I stood in front of the same pulpit where my father once stood. I looked out over the pews where as a boy I doodled sermons into dragons. And I said truth has a habit of making people uncomfortable. That's what makes it holy. The congregation didn't say much, but they listened. That's more than enough. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, made coffee, opened my father's sermon notebook to a random page, and found this note in the margin. If your faith sleeps through injustice, it's not faith, it's furniture. That one made me laugh out loud, then sigh, then nod. I got dressed, packed a bag, and headed out. Not far, just back to Mount Olive. It was Sunday after all.